In 1900, the year Friedrich Nietzsche died, church attendance across Europe was still nearly universal. Almost nobody had heard his name, and yet, less than 50 years later, historians would look back and realize that one sentence, written by an obscure, half-mad philosopher, had somehow predicted the entire shape of the century that followed. 2 world wars, the collapse of old certainties, and a kind of hollow, drifting anxiety that still hasn't fully gone away. That sentence was 4 words long. God is dead. It's probably the most famous line Nietzsche ever wrote, and almost certainly the most misunderstood sentence in the history of philosophy. Most people who quote it have never actually read the passage it comes from. Fewer still understand that Nietzsche wasn't celebrating when he wrote it. He was warning us. If this is your first time here, before we go further, hit subscribe, tap that bell icon, and drop a like because this channel is building a full series unpacking Nietzsche's ideas, and this particular one might be the most important thing he ever wrote. Here's the question this video is actually built around. If Nietzsche wasn't announcing the end of religion as some kind of triumph, what was he actually trying to tell us? And why does a sentence written in 1882 still describe the exact condition so many people are quietly living inside right now, whether they realize it or not? Let's start with where the phrase actually comes from, because the full passage is almost never shown, and it completely changes how the line should be read. In his book, The Gay Science, Nietzsche tells a short, strange parable. A madman runs into a marketplace one morning, holding a lantern in broad daylight, screaming that he is looking for God. The people in the marketplace laugh at him. Did God get lost? Is he hiding? Did he go on a voyage? They mock him, the way a crowd mocks anyone who seems to be panicking about something everyone else has already stopped thinking about. And then the madman turns on them. He tells them the truth. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. And then he asks a series of questions that should stop anyone reading them, even today. How we do this? How are we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What are we doing when we unchain this earth from its sun? The crowd stares at him blankly. And here's the detail almost nobody includes when they quote this passage. The madman eventually falls silent, throws his lantern to the ground, and says, I have come too early. My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way. That's the actual scene Nietzsche wrote, not a celebration. A warning delivered by a man everyone around him thinks has lost his mind, shouting about a catastrophe so enormous that the people standing right next to it haven't even noticed it happened yet. So what did Nietzsche actually mean by God is dead? He wasn't making a scientific claim about the existence or non-existence of a deity. That's not what this passage is about at all. He was making an observation about culture, about the actual foundation Western civilization had been standing on for nearly 2,000 years, and what happens when that foundation quietly gives out underneath everyone, before most people have even noticed the ground has changed. For centuries, meaning, morality, purpose, and a sense of ultimate order had all been anchored to a shared religious framework. Good and evil made sense because they were handed down from something eternal. Suffering made sense because it fit inside a larger story headed toward salvation. Death made sense because it wasn't really the end. This framework didn't just answer people's questions. It made it possible for them to ask the questions at all, the way a floor makes it possible to stand up in the first place. Nietzsche watched the rise of science, reason, and modern skepticism throughout the 19th century, and he understood something most of his contemporaries hadn't yet grasped. That framework was collapsing, not through some single dramatic event, but slowly, quietly, through 1,000 small erosions. Each new scientific discovery, each new philosophical challenge, each generation slightly less certain than the one before it. And once that foundation is gone, you don't just lose religious belief. You lose the entire structure that meaning, morality, and purpose have been resting on. This is why the madman calls it a murder rather than simply a fact. Nietzsche believed this wasn't something that happened to European civilization. It was something European civilization did to itself through its own relentless pursuit of truth and reason. The very tools that have been used, ironically, to build and defend religious belief in the first place, eventually turned around and dismantled it instead. And here's the part that made Nietzsche genuinely afraid rather than triumphant. He believed almost nobody in that marketplace, meaning almost nobody in his own era, actually understood what had just happened. They had already stopped believing in practice in the old religious certainties, but they hadn't yet confronted what that actually meant. They were still living morally and psychologically as if the old foundation was intact, borrowing meaning and values from a structure that had already collapsed underneath them, without noticing they were now standing on nothing. Nietzsche had a name for the condition this creates. He called it nihilism, not simply the absence of belief, but the vertigo that follows once a person actually realizes the old sources of meaning are gone and nothing has yet arrived to replace them. He predicted this realization would eventually spread across the entire culture, and that when it did, it would produce exactly the kind of catastrophic instability the 20th century would go on to experience in horrifying detail. This is why that throwaway line from the madman matters so much. I have come too early. My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way. Nietzsche wasn't just describing a philosophical shift that had already happened. He was predicting a delayed reaction, a crisis that hadn't fully hit yet in 1882, but that he could see building on the horizon, the way you might watch a wave rising from a great distance, long before it actually reaches the shore. So why does any of this matter now, more than a century later? Because the specific religious framework Nietzsche was describing may have declined in many parts of the world, but the deeper structural problem he identified didn't go away with it. It simply changed shape. Nietzsche's real warning was never really about God specifically. It was about what happens to human beings when the foundation beneath their values disappears, and they haven't yet done the difficult work of building something to replace it. Look at the symptoms Nietzsche predicted and see how familiar they sound. A widespread, low-grade sense that nothing quite matters as much as it used to. A culture desperately searching for substitute sources of meaning. Nationalism, consumerism, endless entertainment, online outrage, tribal identity politics. Each one grasping for the same psychological function religion used to serve, without ever quite filling the space. A pervasive anxiety that seems to have no single cause, because it isn't really about any one thing. It's about the absence of the floor that used to be there. Nietzsche believed humanity had exactly two paths available once this collapse became fully visible. The first path is the one he feared most. People cling to comfort, distraction, and conformity, sedating themselves against the emptiness rather than confronting it honestly. He called this figure the last man, and it's hard not to notice how precisely the description fits certain corners of modern life, more than a century later. The second path is the one Nietzsche actually believed in. even though he knew almost no one would be willing to walk it. Someone has to take responsibility for building new values deliberately and honestly out of the wreckage, rather than either pretending the old foundation is still standing or collapsing into meaninglessness because it isn't. This is the entire reason Nietzsche developed his philosophy of self-overcoming, of individually created values, of amor fati, not as abstract intellectual exercises, but as a direct, practical answer to the exact crisis the madman was screaming about in that marketplace. This is what makes God is dead so much more than a provocative quote to put on a t-shirt. It's a diagnosis of a specific historical wound and a challenge that Nietzsche believed every single person, whether religious or not, would eventually have to face directly. Where are you actually getting your values from? Are they resting on a foundation you've genuinely examined? Or are you simply borrowing meaning from a structure that, if you're honest with yourself, you already stopped believing in a long time ago? Nietzsche never claimed to have a comfortable answer to this question. He offered something much harder instead, the demand that each person do the difficult, disorienting work of building meaning deliberately, rather than either clinging to certainties that no longer hold or drifting numbly through a life with no foundation at all. So here's the question worth sitting with. In your own life, right now, where are you standing on ground you've never actually tested? What beliefs, what sources of meaning, what sense of purpose are you quietly relying on without ever having asked yourself honestly whether they can actually bear your weight? The madman ran through that marketplace alone more than 140 years ago, warning a crowd that laughed at him about an event most of them wouldn't understand for decades. Nietzsche believed that event was still coming for all of us. The only real question left is whether you're willing to actually look at it directly, or whether, like that crowd, you'd rather just laugh and go back to whatever you were doing before he interrupted you. If this video gave you something worth thinking about, make sure you're subscribed with the bell turned on, because the next one goes even deeper into exactly what Nietzsche believed we're supposed to build in place of what we lost, and you won't want to miss it.